4:15 in the afternoon. The Syrian-Turkish border. 2 F-16 Fighting Falcons. Call signs Viper 1 and Viper 2 were banking hard at 28,000 feet, their engines carving white scars across a sky the color of a fading bruise. They were not flying a routine combat air patrol. For the last 6 minutes, they had been tracking a contact that appeared on no flight plan and was refusing to answer on any international hailing frequency. The primary subject was an IL-76 cargo plane, a massive, 4-engine foreign-made airframe that should have been lumbering toward a civilian landing strip. Instead, it was flying a zigzag pattern usually reserved for electronic warfare platforms, and the question that kept Captain Marcus Reed's heart hammering against his ribs was why a heavy transport was behaving like a front-line interceptor. The thin air at this altitude was crystalline and freezing, the cold biting at the canopy of the lead fighter. Despite the environmental controls, below the two jets, the brown, scarred expanse of the desert region was beginning to lose the day's heat, the shadows of the jagged hills stretching toward the east like long, dark fingers. The acrid, metallic smell of recycled oxygen filled Reed's mask. As he adjusted his grip on the stick, his eyes scanning the glass cockpit of his jet fighter aircraft. The tactical situation was deteriorating into a bizarre technical anomaly that would define the next hour of the mission. This was the signature element of the engagement. The target aircraft was broadcasting a civilian emergency transponder code, specifically the code for a catastrophic engine failure and a plea for immediate assistance. However, Reed's electronic warfare suite, a sophisticated array of sensors designed to sniff out hostile intent, was telling a different story. The nose of the IL-76 was emitting the high-intensity, coherent pulses of a foreign-made fire control radar, the kind used to guide long-range missiles, not to navigate to an emergency landing. The target was effectively screaming for help on the digital airwaves, while simultaneously searching for a kill. Reed keyed his radio, his voice flat and disciplined despite the adrenaline. He was speaking to the E3 Sentry airborne warning and control system orbiting 100 miles to the west. He asked the controllers to re-verify the target's status, noting the discrepancy between the emergency signal and the aggressive radar painting. The response from the Sentry was hesitant. The cargo plane was registered to a private logistics company out of a foreign city, yet its flight profile was becoming increasingly erratic. The deck of the desert far below seemed to shudder. As the jet fighter aircraft pushed through a pocket of turbulence, Reed could feel the vibration through the soles of his flight boots, a low-frequency hum that matched the steady roar of his jet engine. He looked over his shoulder, seeing the silhouette of Viper 2, tucked into a tight formation. His wingman was silent, waiting for the command that would move them from an intercept to an engagement. Every time the IL-76's radar swept over Reed's jet, a yellow light flashed on his threat warning receiver. It was a rhythmic, digital heartbeat that signaled they were being tracked for a weapon solution. The rules of engagement were clear, about self-defense. But the civilian transponder code created a layer of legal and political fog. If they shot down a plane, pleading for help, the international fallout would be catastrophic. If they waited, they might find themselves at the business end of a missile they never saw coming. The military pilots were now less than 15 miles from the target. At this range, the massive bulk of the IL-76 was visible as a dark, metallic speck against the hazy horizon. The signature element persisted. The emergency code continued to pulse, a digital cry of "Don't shoot," while the fire control radar continued to lock onto the two fighters with predatory precision. Reed checked his fuel state and his weapon settings. He had 2 AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles and 2 AIM-9X Sidewinders. He hoped he would not have to use them, but the way the shadow crew of the cargo plane was flying suggested they were not looking for a runway. They were looking for a fight. 4:22 in the afternoon. The air over the home's governorate. The tactical dilemma on Marcus Reed's heads-up display was becoming a digital nightmare. The IL-76 was now banking at 35 degrees, a heavy, ponderous movement that should have been accompanied by a frantic radio call for landing instructions. Instead, the radio remained a wall of static, and the emergency transponder continued to scream its Mayday code into the void. This was the signature element of the mission exerting its full pressure. The contradiction between the civilian plea for help and the military-grade radar lock that was now pulsing with a lethal frequency. Reed felt a trickle of sweat sting his eyes. The interior of the cockpit was a cramped, utilitarian world of gray metal and glowing green displays, smelling of salt-dried flight suit and the ozone of high-powered electronics. Outside the canopy, the sun was a blinding orange coin sinking toward the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the desert floor 3 miles below. The light caught the rivets on the wing of his F-16, making the aircraft look like a sharpened silver blade cutting through the cooling air. At coordinates 35 degrees 40 minutes north, 37 degrees 12 minutes east, the IL-76 began to accelerate. This was physically impossible for a transport with a supposed catastrophic engine failure. The 4 massive D-30 KP turbofans were not trailing smoke. They were kicking out a steady, blue-white heat haze that registered clearly on Reed's infrared sensors. The aircraft was not falling out of the sky. It was hunting. Sentry, Viper 1, Reed said, his thumb hovering over the weapon release button. Target is ignoring all hails. Radar paint is continuous and high energy. I am being tracked for a weapon solution. Requesting updated rules of engagement. Can you confirm if this airframe has been modified for offensive operations? The response from the E-3 Sentry was delayed by 3 seconds of crackling interference. Viper 1, Sentry. National intelligence assets indicate this specific tail number was seen at a foreign coastal facility 3 days ago, being fitted with external hardpoints. We are assessing the possibility of an experimental electronic warfare or pod-based missile system. You are cleared to close to 5 miles for visual identification, but do not cross the nose. Repeat, do not cross the nose. Reed signaled to his wingman. The 2 F-16s tightened their formation. The roar of their engines, a synchronized thunder that vibrated through the pilot's spines. They were closing the gap at 450 knots. As the distance dropped to 8 miles, the sheer size of the Soviet-era transport became imposing. It was a winged Leviathan, its olive drab paint chipped and weathered by years of hard service in rugged climates. The environment around them was shifting as the sun dipped lower. The sky was turning a deep, bruised purple, and the first few stars were beginning to prick through the atmosphere. The cold was intensifying, the heater in the F-16 struggling to keep the cockpit at a comfortable temperature. Reed could feel the tension in his shoulders, a dull ache that radiated down his arms to his gloved hands. At a range of 6 miles, the IL-76 did something that ended the debate. The cargo doors at the rear of the aircraft did not open, but a small, rectangular panel on the underside of the fuselage slid back. A sensor turret, blackened and sleek, emerged. It wasn't a camera for landing gear observation. It was a laser designator, and it immediately pinned Reed's fighter with a concentrated beam of light that his sensors identified as a guidance signal for a surface-to-air missile battery, located somewhere in the hills below. The signature element had reached its breaking point. The target was using its Mayday status to bait the military fighters into a kill zone, acting as a spotter for hidden forces on the ground. The civilian emergency code was a lie, a digital mask for a sophisticated ambush. Viper 1 is spiked. Laser designator active, Reed shouted, banking his jet into a high G turn that slammed him into his seat, his vision narrowing as the gravity pulled the blood from his brain. Sentry, the target is painting us for ground-based fires, requesting permission to neutralize the threat. The air around the F-16s seemed to crackle with the energy of the engagement. The silence of the desert below was about to be shattered by the sound of supersonic flight and the roar of exploding ordnance. The decision was no longer about international law. It was about the survival of the flight. 4:26 in the afternoon. The sky over northern Syria was a sharpening gradient of orange and deep indigo, the air growing thinner and more turbulent as the 2 F-16 Fighting Falcons climbed to match the unexpected ascent of their quarry. Captain Marcus Reed could feel the pressure of the G-suit bladders tightening around his calves and thighs, a rhythmic, mechanical squeeze, designed to keep the blood from pooling in his lower extremities as he pulled the stick into a sharp, climbing turn. The cockpit of the F-16 was a symphony of low-intensity hums and the steady, reassuring thrum of the engine. But the atmosphere was thick with the sharp, metallic tang of ozone and the stale, dry scent of bottled oxygen. Outside the canopy, the temperature had plummeted to 40 degrees below zero, causing a fine lattice of frost to begin creeping inward from the edges of the glass, while the heat from the avionics bays below Reed's feet kept the cockpit floor uncomfortably warm. The IL-76 transport was no longer behaving like a civilian aircraft in distress. It had banked hard to the north, its four massive engines pouring out a dense, dark exhaust as it pushed toward its maximum service ceiling. Despite the heavy, lumbering nature of the airframe, the pilot was handling the Soviet-designed jet with a level of aggressive precision that suggested thousands of hours in high-performance cockpits. It was a terrifying display of airmanship, made more surreal by the fact that the signature element of the engagement remained active. The emergency transponder was still broadcasting a civilian plea for help. A digital mayday that flashed rhythmically on Reed's tactical display. Even as the cargo plane's military radar continued to hammer his aircraft with high-energy search pulses. "Sentry, Viper 1, Reed said, his voice strained as he fought the physical resistance of the climb. Target is now at 32,000 feet and accelerating. The emergency transponder is still active, but they are flying. A combat evasive profile. I am seeing aggressive maneuvering and continued radar painting, requesting permission to fire a warning burst from the 20mm cannon." The silence from the airborne warning and control system lasted for 12 long seconds, a gap in communication that felt like an eternity at 500 knots. During those seconds, Reed watched the IL-76's shadow stretch across the white-capped peaks of the mountains near the Turkish border. The ground below was a fractured mosaic of brown rock and deep, shadowed valleys. A landscape that offered no mercy to anything that fell from this altitude. Viper 1, Sentry. Negative on the warning burst, the controller finally replied, the voice sounding thin and distant through the encryption layers. "The State Department is currently on the line with the foreign embassy in the capital. We are attempting to verify the manifest. Intelligence is reporting that this tail number may be associated with a private military contractor group, not the foreign Air Force. The rules of engagement remain restrictive. You are to maintain a visual trail only. Do not engage unless fired upon." Reed's jaw tightened. The instruction was a death sentence in the world of modern aerial combat, where being fired upon, often, meant a missile had already impacted your airframe. He looked to his left, seeing the silhouette of Viper 2 Lieutenant Sarah Claw Jenkins, mirroring his every move. Her F-16 was a dark, lethal shape against the orange sun, its wings loaded with a full complement of air-to-air missiles that were currently useless under the current orders. The environment within the flight was becoming increasingly claustrophobic. The yellow spike light on Reed's threat receiver began to pulse faster, the tone in his headset shifting from a low hum to a persistent, high-pitched chirp. The IL-76 was no longer just painting him, it was attempting to achieve a hard lock. This was the escalation Reed had feared. The contractor pilots in the transport were testing the American resolve, using their civilian status as a shield while they prepared an offensive move. Suddenly, the IL-76 began to dump a massive cloud of infrared flares from its tail section. A cascade of brilliant, white-hot magnesium stars tumbled into the freezing air, lighting up the sky with a blinding radiance that bleached out Reed's night vision sensors. It was a classic, defensive maneuver, one intended to blind any following aircraft or to decoy an incoming missile. The fact that the target had deployed them proved beyond any legal doubt that the aircraft was combat-equipped. The signature element, the civilian Mayday signal, was still pulsing, a ghost in the machine that contrasted violently with the burning flares and the predatory radar lock. Reed felt a cold, hard knot of certainty form in his stomach. The crew of the transport were not victims of a mechanical failure. They were professional combatants who were using every trick in the book to lure the F-16s into a vulnerable position. Viper 2, break right, Reed shouted, as the radar warning receiver suddenly transitioned into a continuous, high-volume scream. The target is active. They just dropped flares and we are spiked. Hard lock, hard lock. The desert floor below seemed to rotate as Reed slammed his jet into a defensive brake, the G-force crushing the breath from his lungs. The mission had moved beyond a simple intercept. The escalation was complete, and the two pilots were now fighting for their lives in a legal and tactical gray zone where the enemy was screaming for help while trying to kill them. 4:32 in the afternoon. The Al Udeid Air Base Combined Air Operations Center. Inside the darkened climate-controlled hub, the situation on the digital map was flashing red. The two F-16 Fighting Falcons were now deep into a high-stakes game of chicken, with a target that refused to follow the script. The United States Air Force's Central Command Intelligence Summary, received 24 hours prior, had assessed all IL-76 airframes operated by the private contractor logistics firm as strictly non-kinetic and lacking any internal or external offensive weapons carriage capability. That assessment was being dismantled in real time as the cargo plane continued to paint the American fighters with its fire control radar while maintaining its fraudulent civilian emergency broadcast. Captain Marcus Reed watched the threat warning receiver in his cockpit. The spike was no longer intermittent. It was a solid, unwavering tone that meant the target's radar was providing a continuous tracking solution to a weapon system. The cold, dry air of the cockpit was filled with the electronic chirp of his own defensive suites, a sound that competed with the heavy, rhythmic breathing in his mask. Outside, the Syrian landscape was a jagged blur of shadow and rock, the high-altitude winds buffeting the F-16 and creating a subtle, constant vibration in the control stick. The signature element of the engagement, the conflicting electronic identities, had forced the decision-makers at the operations center into a legal stalemate. The judge advocate general officers on the floor were debating the implications of firing on an aircraft broadcasting a Mayday code. If the American pilots fired first, the Russian government would have a propaganda victory of immense proportions, claiming the United States had shot down a civilian plane in distress. If they waited, they were allowing a hostile actor to coordinate a strike against two multi-million-dollar aircraft and their pilots. Sentry, Viper 1, Reed said, his voice dropping into a low, focused register. We are now 5 miles out. The laser designator from the target is still active and pinned to my airframe. My wingman and I are currently defensive, performing high-G maneuvers to break the lock. I am declaring an immediate hostile act and hostile intent by the target aircraft, requesting permission to neutralize. The voice that came back was not the controller from the E3 Sentry, but the mission commander from the operations center, Viper 1. This is Central Command led. We have a visual on your data link. The transponder remains on the civilian emergency code. Are you certain of the laser designation? Lead, Viper 1, Reed replied, his jaw tight. I have the designation confirmed on my threat receiver and my targeting pod. This is not a navigation error. They are spotting for a surface-to-air battery. I have 45 minutes of fuel remaining before I hit my bingo state. We need a decision now. As he spoke, the IL-76 banked violently toward the neighboring border, attempting to lure the F-16s into a position where a cross-border radar lock would complicate the legal situation even further. The air around the fighters was crystal clear, the setting sun turning the clouds below into a sea of fire, but the tactical reality was becoming increasingly dark. The acrid smell of hot electronics and the faint scent of jet fuel pervaded the cockpit as Reed pushed the throttle forward, the engine responding with a deep, powerful roar that shook his entire body. The mission commander's voice returned, this time with a hard, decisive edge. Viper 1. We have just received a flash report from National Intelligence. The crew on that aircraft has been identified as a special operations detachment from a private military company. They are not civilian. They are designated as an illegal combatant force. Rules of engagement are now status-based. You are weapons-free. Repeat, Viper 1. You are weapons-free on the primary target. Monitor for neighboring border proximity. Reed felt a cold surge of adrenaline wash over his skin. The ambiguity was gone. The signature element, the civilian mask, had been stripped away by the intelligence update. He switched his master arm to the on position, the green symbols on his heads-up display shifting into the lethal configuration for an air-to-air engagement. He looked over at Viper 2, seeing his wingman shift into the trail position, her jet a dark, predatory shape against the dying light. The desert floor below was now entirely in shadow, the only light coming from the orange glow on the horizon and the flickering lights of the IL-76's navigation lamps, lights they were still using to maintain the illusion of being a lost transport. Reed took a deep breath, the oxygen tasting metallic and cold. He was 3 miles from the target, and the time for talking had ended. 4:36 in the afternoon. The airspace 12 miles south of the foreign border. Captain Marcus Reed stabilized his military aircraft, the airframe vibrating with a low, predatory hum as he brought the pipper on his heads-up display directly over the heat signature of the cargo plane. The massive cargo plane was still banking hard, its 4 engines screaming at maximum thrust, while the signature element of the mission reached its final, surreal crescendo. The cockpit speakers continued to emit the rhythmic, 3-tone chirp of the civilian emergency transponder, a digital plea for mercy that contrasted violently with the solid, high-pitched growl of the missile seeking a lethal lock on the target's radar emitter. The air was cold and thin, the sky a deepening shade of violet that made the orange glow from the transport's engines look like 4 burning eyes in the dark. Reed's thumb moved to the red button on the side of his throttle. He took one final breath of the dry, metallic-tasting oxygen, his chest rising against the restrictive harness of his seat. Viper 1. Fox 3. He called out, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of electronic noise. The launch was not a silent event. Beneath the left wing of the military aircraft, a heavy, mechanical clunk echoed through the fuselage as the rail released the missile. A split second later, the solid fuel rocket motor ignited with a violent, white-hot roar that Reed could feel in the soles of his boots. A massive plume of gray smoke and brilliant orange flame streaked forward, momentarily bleaching the cockpit in a harsh, artificial light. The smell of burning chemical propellant, sharp and acidic, was sucked into the cockpit's environmental system for a fleeting second as the missile accelerated toward twice the speed of sound. The missile tracked perfectly, a silver needle darting across the darkening sky. The crew of the cargo plane must have seen the flash, because the aircraft began a desperate, lumbering roll to the left, dropping a final, frantic cloud of magnesium flares. But the missile was locked onto the specific electronic signature of the fire control radar, ignoring the heat decoys. The strike occurred exactly 6 seconds after launch. The missile did not just explode. It drove itself directly into the junction where the right wing met the main fuselage. The initial impact was a dull, heavy thud that carried across the 3-mile gap, followed instantly by a catastrophic rupture of the main fuel cells. The right wing did not break. It was obliterated, sheared off by a massive internal pressure wave that sent a column of orange fire and white steam 100 feet into the air. The fuselage of the cargo plane groaned, a sound of metal tearing that was slower and more agonizing than a simple explosion. The aircraft twisted violently, the remaining 3 engines still producing thrust and forcing the broken airframe into a terminal, corkscrewing dive. Fragments of the tail section, glowing red with residual heat, were thrown outward like shrapnel. glinting in the last rays of the sun. Reed's body reacted before his mind could process the kill. He slammed the stick to the right, pulling 6 Gs to clear the debris field, the weight of his own flight helmet, feeling like 100 pounds on his neck. His vision blurred at the edges, the gray veil of a blackout threatening to take him. As he watched the burning wreckage of the transport fall away, he felt the vibration of the shockwave hitting his jet, not a sharp crack, but a heavy, rhythmic thumping that rattled the canopy and made his teeth ache. The field immediately after the strike was a chaotic graveyard of falling metal. A long, vertical trail of black smoke and white vapor marked the descent of the cargo plane, the fire from the ruptured tanks, casting a flickering, hellish light on the clouds below. The only sound left in Reed's headset was the static of the radio and the heavy, ragged breathing of his wingman. The digital chirp of the civilian transponder, the signature element that had defined the afternoon, had finally gone silent. The Mayday had ended in a fireball. Splash 1, Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins, whispered over the common frequency, her voice shaking slightly. Viper 1, confirm splash. The target has impacted the deck. Coordinates 35 degrees 44 minutes north, 37 degrees 18 minutes east. Reed leveled his wings, his heart finally beginning to slow its frantic pace. The cockpit was filled with the smell of his own sweat and the fading tang of the missile propellant. Below him, the desert floor was dark, save for the growing orange crater, where the cargo plane had hit the ground. The tactical victory was complete, but as he looked at the wreckage, he knew the political battle was only beginning. The aircraft he had just destroyed was a civilian-registered hull, crewed by men who officially did not exist, flying for a company that would likely deny their presence within the hour. He checked his fuel state. He had 38 minutes of airtime remaining. Viper 2. Form up, he commanded, his voice regaining its professional edge. We need a visual pass of the crash site. Before the local militias get there, we need to see who is actually in that cockpit. 4:42 in the afternoon. The Syrian desert floor. Captain Marcus Reed pushed the nose of his F-16 Fighting Falcon down, the airframe whistling as it sliced through the thickening air of the lower altitudes. Behind him, Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins followed in a loose tactical trail, her jet banking in a graceful, lethal arc. They were descending from the cold, thin silence of 30,000 feet into the shimmering heat haze that still clung to the desert floor. The sun was now a low, angry sliver on the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows that turned the jagged wadis into deep trenches of absolute black. The crash site was located at coordinates 35 degrees 44 minutes north, 37 degrees 18 minutes east. As the two fighters leveled off at 3,000 feet, the scale of the destruction became visible on their high-definition cockpit displays. A tall column of oily soot, thick and suffocating, climbed straight into the still air, marking the spot where the heavy transport had impacted the Earth. The wreckage was spread across a debris field that stretched for nearly 800 meters, a scorched scar of pulverized aluminum and burning rubber that looked like a jagged wound on the face of the desert. Reed stabilized his jet and activated the advanced targeting pod. The infrared sensor, slave to his helmet-mounted cueing system, slewed toward the center of the impact crater. The screen on his right-hand multi-function display flickered to life, showing the world in varying shades of thermal intensity. The main fuselage was a white-hot mass of molten metal, the heat so intense that the surrounding sand had begun to vitrify into dark, jagged glass. Viper 1. I have visual on the primary impact point, Reed said, his voice echoing in the clinical silence of his mask. The airframe is completely compromised. I am seeing multiple secondary fires along the wing spars. There are no signs of life. I repeat, no signs of life. As he orbited the site, the signature element of the mission returned to his mind, with a haunting clarity. For over an hour, that aircraft had been a digital ghost, broadcasting a civilian mayday while hunting with a military radar. Now, the electronic deception was over. The radio frequency that had been filled with the rhythmic chirp of the emergency transponder was dead. There was no more mayday, no more fire control lock. The silence was heavy and absolute, broken only by the occasional crackle of static. and the steady, reassuring thrum of his own engine. The environment at this altitude was a sensory assault. The cockpit smelled of dry, recirculated air, and the faint, sweet scent of the hydraulic fluid that powered his flight controls. Outside the canopy, the air was a hazy mix of dust, and the acrid, chemical stench of burning jet fuel rising from the wreck. Reed could see the flickering orange light of the fires, reflecting off the underside of his wings, a hellish glow that made the gray camouflage of his military aircraft look like rusted iron. "Viper 2, look at the tail section," Jenkins called out, her voice tight with focus, about 200 meters north of the main crater. "It looks like it stayed relatively intact." Reed slewed his camera to the north. The massive T-shaped tail of the heavy transport had been sheared off during the terminal dive and had pancaked into a soft dune. The olive drab paint was scorched, but the markings were still legible under the high magnification zoom. There was no national insignia, no foreign military red star, no foreign flag. Instead, there was a stylized blue logo of a winged globe, the corporate emblem of the private logistics firm mentioned in the earlier intelligence brief. "Confirmed, Viper 2, Reed replied. "That is, a contractor hull. Lead, be advised, we are seeing no military markings on the wreckage. This matches the assessment of a deniable asset. I am also seeing several large, rectangular crates that were thrown clear of the hold. They don't look like humanitarian aid. They look like electronics cabinets." As they made their third pass, a series of dust clouds appeared on the horizon to the east. A convoy of Technicals pickup trucks with heavy machine guns mounted in the beds was racing toward the crash site at high speed. These were local paramilitary forces, likely the same ones the cargo plane had been spotting for with its laser designator only minutes before. The tactical victory was shifting into a frantic race for information. If the local militias reached the wreckage first, any evidence of the Shadow Crew or their sophisticated electronic warfare gear would disappear into the black market or the hands of foreign intelligence. Reed checked his fuel again. 34 minutes until he reached his reserve limit. "Sentry, Viper 1, Reed transmitted. We have multiple ground contacts closing on the site. Estimated time of arrival is 6 minutes. We need a decision on whether to orbit and discourage recovery or if we are braking for the tanker. The signature element is confirmed destroyed, but the evidence is about to be compromised." The orange sun finally slipped below the horizon, plunging the desert into a sudden, deep twilight. The fires from the wreckage became the brightest things in the world, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to reach out toward the two military aircraft as they banked for another pass. The air was cooling rapidly, the sudden temperature drop causing the metal of the cockpit to groan as it contracted. The mission was moving into its next phase, one where the bullets were replaced by data, and the battlefield was no longer the sky, but the charred remains of a lie. 4:52 in the afternoon. The deepening twilight over the Syrian desert. From the cockpit of Viper 1, Captain Marcus Reed watched the infrared feed as the first of the local Technicals skidded to a halt at the edge of the burning debris field. Through the high-resolution lens of the Sniper Advanced Targeting Pod, the world was a high-contrast landscape of white heat and black shadows. 6 pickup trucks, their beds crowded with armed men, formed a jagged perimeter around the smoldering remains of the IL-76. The air was cooling rapidly now, the desert floor surrendering the day's heat in a visible shimmer that distorted the images on Reed's multifunction display. The acrid, chemical smell of burning jet fuel and scorched rubber seemed to seep through the F-16's environmental seals, a persistent reminder of the violence that had occurred only 12 minutes ago. "Sentry, Viper 1, Reed said, his voice leveled despite the rising tension. "Ground forces have arrived. At the crash site, I am observing approximately 30 to 40 personnel. They are not behaving like a medical team. They are immediately moving toward the tail section and the electronics crates we identified on the previous pass." The signature element of the mission, the equipment that had allowed a cargo plane to paint 2 fighters with a fire control radar, was now visible as a twisted, blackened hulk of silicon and steel. One of the rectangular crates had split open upon impact, spilling a complex array of circuit boards and cooling fans onto the sand. The militia members scrambled over the dunes, their movements urgent and practiced, as they began to haul the larger components toward the trucks. As Reed banked his jet to keep the camera on target, he caught a glimpse of something that chilled him more than the dawn d'essence, freezing air outside the canopy. Two men in tactical gear, wearing nondescript tan uniforms without national flags or rank insignia, stepped out from the lead vehicle. They were not local militia. Their movements were disciplined, their posture that of professional soldiers. They moved directly to the cockpit section of the wreckage, ignoring the fires that were still licking at the jagged edges of the fuselage. Viper 2. Do you see the recovery team? Reed asked. His eyes locked on the screen. I see them. Viper 1. Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins replied. Those aren't locals. They're using high-end portable cutting tools. They're after something in the flight deck, probably the data recorders or the encryption modules. The environment around the crash site was becoming a chaotic theater of shadow and flame. The orange glow of the fires illuminated the faces of the recovery team, their features sharp and hard in the flickering light. The cold air above the desert was filled with the low-frequency roar of the two F-16s, a sound that the men on the ground seemed to ignore with a calculated indifference. One of the professionals on the ground paused, looking up toward the sky. For a brief second, Reed felt a strange sense of connection, as if the man could see him through the miles of atmosphere and the layers of glass. The recovery specialist then returned to his work, pulling a heavy, metallic briefcase from the ruins of the navigator's station. The report from the Air Operations Center flashed on Reed's data link. The private military company associated with the tail number had just issued a public statement through a news agency in Moscow. They claimed the aircraft was on a humanitarian mission carrying medical supplies and that the crew consisted of 4 civilian pilots and 2 logistics technicians. They were already accusing the United States of a premeditated act of aggression against a non-combatant flight. Reed looked back at the screen. The non-combatants on the ground were currently tossing military-grade encryption hardware into the back of a truck, while their companions stood guard with Western-made assault rifles. The signature element, the sophisticated radar painting pod, was being dismantled with professional speed. By the time any international investigators reached this coordinate, there would be nothing left but a charred hull and the lie of a civilian massacre. Sentry, Viper 1. Reed transmitted, his hand tightening on the stick. We are seeing a coordinated recovery of sensitive military hardware. These are professional operators, likely the same group that crewed the airframe, requesting permission to perform a low-altitude show of force. Negative. Viper 1. The response came back, sounding tired and burdened by the weight of the growing diplomatic crisis. You are at bingo fuel. Brake for the tanker and RTB. Do not, repeat, do not engage the ground forces. The situation is moving to the State Department now. Your mission is over. Reed checked his fuel gauge. He had 31 minutes of flight time remaining, barely enough to reach the tanker orbiting over the Mediterranean. He looked down one last time at the burning scar in the desert. The smoke was drifting toward the Turkish border. .505 in the evening. The airspace over the eastern Mediterranean. Captain Marcus Reed banked his F-16 Fighting Falcon away from the darkening Syrian border, the desert floor now a sea of absolute shadow behind him. The sky ahead was a deep velvet blue, punctuated by the brilliant white strobe of the KC-135 Stratotanker, waiting at 22,000 feet. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the engagement was beginning to ebb, replaced by a cold, hollow fatigue that made the cockpit feel smaller and more restrictive. The acrid scent of dry oxygen and the faint, sweet smell of hydraulic fluid remained trapped in his mask, a sensory tether to the machine that had just ended 6 lives. As the refueling boom from the tanker connected with a muffled, metallic clank, a high-priority intelligence update began to stream across Reed's secondary multifunction display. The United States Air Force's Central Command had completed a rapid biometric and signals intelligence sweep of the target. This was the moment the true nature of the Shadow crew was revealed. The 6 individuals aboard the IL-76 were not members of the Russian Federation's regular military, nor were they simple logistics technicians. The flight lead had been identified as a former colonel in the Russian Aerospace Forces, who had vanished from official roles 4 years prior. The co-pilot and the electronic warfare officer were also veterans of high-performance combat units, all currently employed by a private military corporation with deep ties to the Kremlin. They were highly paid professionals, pilots who had traded their commissions for the high-risk, high-reward world of deniable operations. The signature element of the battle, the clever use of a civilian emergency transponder to mask a military-grade radar lock, was a tactic directly lifted from the handbook of this specific mercenary group, Viper 1. This is Sentry. The controller's voice broke through the hum of the refueling process. Be advised, the recovery team you observed on the ground has been identified as a specialized technical exploitation unit. We have intercepted their communications. They have successfully retrieved the primary electronic warfare pod and the cockpit voice recorder. The narrative being pushed by their parent company is already gaining traction in international media. Reed watched the fuel numbers on his display climb as the tanker pumped hundreds of gallons of JP-8 into his wings. The Mayday signal that had confused the rules of engagement for over an hour was now the cornerstone of a global disinformation campaign. Because the contractors had recovered the hardware that proved the aircraft's hostile intent, the United States was left with nothing but radar logs and the testimony of 2 pilots. In the court of public opinion, a digital signal for help carried more weight than a technical report of a laser designation. The environment within the flight had shifted from the kinetic intensity of combat to the quiet, brooding atmosphere of a diplomatic aftermath. Outside the canopy, the stars were appearing in thousands, their cold light reflecting off the silver skin of the tanker. The air was perfectly still at this altitude, the only movement, the slight, rhythmic swaying of the refueling boom. Reed felt a heavy weight in his chest, as he realized that the tactical perfection of the shootdown was being eroded by the ambiguity of the target's identity. "Understood, Sentry," Reed replied, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "We are nearly topped off. We will proceed to base." Has there been any response from the Syrian or Russian air defense networks? "Negative, Viper 1, the controller said. "The regular forces are staying clear. It appears they are letting the contractors handle the fallout. Moscow has officially stated they have no military personnel in that sector. It is a clean hands policy for them, and a legal minefield for us." Reed disconnected from the tanker, the F-16, dropping away into the night. He looked back toward the east, where the burning wreckage of the IL-76 was likely being picked clean by the Shadow crew on the ground. The signature element of the mission, the lie of the emergency signal, had done its job. It hadn't saved the plane, but it had poisoned the victory. The mission had been a success by every military metric, but as Reed turned toward his home base, he knew the official report would be buried under layers of classification to avoid a direct confrontation with a ghost. 6:15 in the evening. In Sirlik Air Base, Turkey. The wheels of Viper 1 touched down on the concrete runway with a sharp, rhythmic chirp, followed seconds later by Viper 2. As Captain Marcus Reed taxied his F-16 Fighting Falcon toward the hardened aircraft shelter, the cooling fans of his avionics bay hummed with a frantic intensity, a mechanical echo of the mental exhaustion settling over him. The air on the tarmac was thick with the scent of burnt rubber and the heavy, sweet perfume of jet fuel from the dozens of tankers and strike aircraft lining the ramps. The sky over Turkey was now a deep, ink-black canopy, the stars obscured by the high-intensity floodlights that washed the base in a harsh, artificial glare. Inside the secure debriefing room, the atmosphere was clinical and suffocating. The room smelled of stale coffee, industrial floor cleaner, and the collective sweat of the intelligence officers waiting for the pilots. A flat panel display on the far wall was already looped on the infrared footage from Reed's targeting pod the moment the AIM-120 missile tore through the wing root of the IL-76, turning a billion-dollar electronic warfare platform into a plummeting funeral pyre. The legal scramble was already in full swing. Two officers from the Judge Advocate General's Corps stood in the corner, their faces illuminated by the blue light of their laptops as they reviewed the engagement logs. They were not looking at the kill. They were looking at the timestamps. They were obsessing over the signature element of the mission, the exact millisecond the civilian emergency transponder code overlapped with the lethal laser designation from the target. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs just issued a formal protest through the embassy in Washington, a senior intelligence colonel said, his voice grating like sandpaper. They are calling it an unprovoked attack on a humanitarian flight. They are claiming the aircraft was carrying neonatal equipment and vaccines for a hospital in Aleppo. They have even released a manifest of the cargo, 6,000 units of refrigerated medicine. Reed sat at the metal table, his flight suit still damp against his skin. He looked at the footage on the wall. He saw the MAYDAY code pulsing on the screen. He also saw the distinct, crystalline patterns of the fire control radar spikes that had threatened his life. "The manifest is a lie, Colonel," Reed said, his voice sounding hollow and metallic. "We saw the recovery team. We saw them pulling encryption racks and radar components out of that wreckage. Those weren't vaccines. They were hunting us. We know that, Captain," the colonel replied, leaning over the table. But the recovery team was efficient. They didn't leave anything behind that couldn't be explained away as part of a sophisticated navigation system. By the time the international inspectors get there, they'll find a charred hull and a few crates of shattered glass. The shadow crew we killed officially doesn't exist. Their families won't receive medals. They'll receive a quiet deposit into a bank account in Cyprus. The dilemma was a classic example of gray zone warfare, where the tactical reality of the battlefield was eclipsed by the strategic narrative of the information space. The United States Air Force had achieved its objective, the threat was neutralized, and the ambush was broken. But the cost was a diplomatic nightmare that was already beginning to destabilize the fragile coalition in northern Syria. The MAYDAY code, the signature element of the deception, had provided the adversary with a weapon more effective than any missile: the appearance of victimhood. The environment in the room felt increasingly heavy. The hum of the air conditioning, a constant low-frequency pressure. Reed watched the loop of the explosion again. In the white-hot flash of the impact, he realized that the victory was purely physical. The aircraft was gone. The pilots were dead, but the intent behind the mission remained fully operational. The use of private contractors had provided the Russian state with total deniability, allowing them to test American defenses without the risk of an official declaration of war. As the meeting broke up, Reed walked out into the cool night air. The base was a hive of activity, with ground crews working to turn the jets around for the next mission. But the sense of accomplishment he usually felt after a successful engagement was missing. The tactical victory felt like a trap that had successfully snapped shut, not on his aircraft, but on the truth of what had happened in that darkening sky. 10 in the morning. The 11th of April, 2026. The United States Air Force's Central Command Headquarters. The final mission summary lay on a mahogany desk, its contents a clinical distillation of 67 minutes of flight time. The document noted the expenditure of one AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missile and the confirmed destruction of one IL-76 cargo airframe. Casualties were listed as 6 personnel, all presumed deceased at the impact site. There were no American injuries and 0 damage to the 2 F-16 Fighting Falcons. On a spreadsheet, the engagement was a perfect vertical column of success, a tactical victory achieved with maximum efficiency and 0 loss of life for the United States. But the atmosphere in the windowless briefing room was far from triumphant. The air was heavy with the smell of scorched coffee and the static hum of a dozen encrypted servers. Captain Marcus Reed sat in a hard plastic chair, his eyes fixed on the final satellite image of the crash site. The signature element of the engagement, the civilian emergency transponder code, was highlighted in a red box on the side of the briefing slide. That digital signal, that Mayday, was now appearing on every major news network across the globe, accompanied by grainier footage of the burning wreckage taken by local villagers. The formal report will state that the engagement was within the established rules of engagement, the briefing officer said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. The radar logs and the laser warning receiver data from Viper 1 are being archived. We have proof of hostile intent. We have proof of the fire control lock. But the public narrative is already set. The company that owned that hull has filed a claim in an international court, and the foreign military is using the incident to justify a new deployment of long-range surface-to-air missiles along the border. Reed looked at the screen, where the orange glow of the debris field seemed to pulse, like a dying heart. The tactical reality was that he had saved himself and his wingman from a sophisticated ambush. The philosophical reality, the one that belonged to the literature of war rather than the reports of it, was that the victory had solved nothing. In the gray zone of the 21st century, a kill was no longer a period at the end of a sentence. It was merely a comma in a long, rambling narrative of deniable aggression and perceived victimhood. The environment of the headquarters was a maze of fluorescent lights and sterile hallways, a world away from the freezing, crystalline air of 28,000 feet. Yet, Reed could still feel the phantom vibration of the missile launch in the soles of his boots. He could still hear the rhythmic, three-tone chirp of the transponder pleading for a mercy its crew never intended to show. The deception had survived. The destruction of the aircraft. It had mutated into a political weapon that was now being used to squeeze the United States out of the theater. As the briefing concluded, the commanding officer of the wing stood up and walked toward the large-scale map of the region. He did not look at the crash site. His eyes were fixed on a point 200 miles to the north, where a new set of electronic signatures had begun to appear on the morning's intelligence sweep. The shadow crew had been replaced. New hulls were moving into the sector, new transponders were being programmed, and new lies were being drafted in windowless offices in foreign military headquarters. "We achieved the objective," the commander said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "The threat was neutralized. The airspace was defended. But I want you both to look at the board," he gestured toward the map, where the symbols for hostile radar units were appearing in clusters that hadn't been there 48 hours ago. By shooting down that plane, we gave them the excuse they needed to move their frontline integrated air defense system into the valley. We won the dogfight, but we might have just lost the corridor. Reed stood up, his joints popping after the long hours of restricted movement. He looked at the commander, then back at the map. The open question was no longer about whether he should have fired. It was about whether the entire engagement had been a calculated sacrifice by the adversary, a baiting of the military fighters not just for a tactical kill, but for a strategic realignment. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the distant, muffled roar of a jet taking off from a nearby runway. The mission was complete, the report was signed, and the medals would eventually be issued in a quiet ceremony. But as Marcus Reed walked out into the bright, unforgiving sunlight over the airbase, he realized the next problem was already forming in the shadows of the victory. The Mayday had been a signal for a much larger storm, and the first clouds were already crossing the horizon.